everyone. This is a conversation with Mina Salami. We had this conversation back in the summer. It's another wonderful, wonderful book, Sensuous Knowledge, which has influenced me a lot in my own work. And you probably hear me talk a lot about finding different ways up the mountain, which is a parable that Mina expresses at the beginning of her book, and it sort of structures her book, and we talk about that here. So it's another way of trying to hold the paradox, trying to understand how to move into another way of thinking beyond either or. I just love her work. I love what she's doing. She's combining all kinds of disciplines and approaches, and she's making her own way and always has been. She's really a path maker, a path finder, and someone I hope you'll read. Her book, Sensuous Knowledge, is just one of my favorites. And she's got a new book coming out soon, which we'll talk about next year, and I'm looking forward to that. So I send Mina a lot of love and gratitude for this conversation that we had, this exploration that we, two philosophers or thinkers, had together. That's the kind of conversations I love, and it's what this channel is all about. And I'm glad you're here. I hope you join this conversation. And I send you a lot of love today too, and philosophy. All right, bye.
The problem that we have in modern Westernized society is that we think of paradox almost as something negative rather than something generative, and something that's actually just a fact of reality. You know, things are paradoxical. One of the reasons I think we look at things in such a binary, dualistic way is because we are very focused on the kind of end destination rather than of seeing the whole thing, the vastness of it. Double consciousness is one of the most important or valuable ideas, philosophical ideas that we have as a human species. To double consciousness vis-a-vis our relationship to what we call nature, which we are a part of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We know the world of nature to a notable extent, but there are things that are mysterious that we don't know about the world of non-human nature, as we sort of clumsily refer to it as. And then we know the world of ourselves as a part of nature, as the human part of nature. And that is also a kind of double consciousness. The obvious truth here is that if we can look at the mountain from as many angles as possible, this metaphorical mountain, the truer and the richer our understanding of it will be. We will see the parts that are dead and arid, and that will be okay. And then we'll see the other parts too. And I start with that story because I guess I wanted readers to immediately have knowing that the book that they're about to read is written by somebody who perceives themselves as that second explorer, as I do, especially in the world of ideas and epistemology and knowledge. But it was mainly through going into my mind and exploring. And when I was probably about 7 years old or something like that. And what I'm going to say now is a kind of a trick also for people who are struggling to learn how to meditate. Sensuousness is not necessarily about physical pleasures. It's about a kind of a full embodied experience. In the Yoruba worldview, knowledge is a divinity. And it's one of the divinities that creates the world. Without it, there is no world making. If we can look at the mountain from as many angles as possible, this metaphorical mountain, the truer and the richer our understanding of it will be. Love is everything. Actually, love is the superpower that we don't.
Love is the mountain.
Love is the mountain.
Hi, Mina. It's so nice to see you and to meet you. Thank you for being here today.
It's great to meet you, Andrea. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about your book, Sensuous Knowledge, which I love it so much. It really moved me on a lot of different levels, and we'll get into some of that. But first, maybe we should start with the words and maybe then unpack how you came to writing it. But first, this word sensuous, it was really interesting to me that you define it in a different way than sensuality. This has always been a word I love a lot, sensuous and sensuality. And you gave me something there with defining it different and talking about Milton and the origin. So maybe we could start there and you could explain what this word means, sensuous, for you.
Sure. I also have always loved the word sensuous and sensuality. So in making a distinction between the two, I don't mean to create any kind of hierarchy, but I do make the distinction in the book and insofar as sensuous knowledge is concerned. And the distinction is that sensuality sensuality and also anything to do with the senses in that regard has to do with bodily pleasures. And whereas sensuousness is not necessarily about physical pleasures, it's about a kind of a full embodied experience. That is how I look at it. Now, there are countless debates over the centuries, or maybe not debates is not the right word, it's more conversations about the differences between sensuousness and sensuality. And of course, the two get conflated quite often. In the beauty industry, for instance, I've come since writing this book, I keep coming across, the ways that the word sensuous is used, and it's used to describe perfumes and things like that. So it is to convey something quite sensual, which at the same time, I think you could also apply to sensuous knowledge. I like the openness and the vastness of the word. And it came to me quite quite a thud, this phrase, sensuous knowledge. And even though, as I say, it is a word that I've always liked, but it wasn't something that I'd ever thought about writing a book around. And I'd never paired it with knowledge. So when the title for the book came, it kind of came as a ready-made phrase. And I knew that it was something that I wanted to delve into and to try and put my finger on and explore.
I really like this distinction because having studied neuroscience and philosophy, often or just in general, right, growing up as a human, you kind of separate the senses as if there's taste and there's touch and there's sound and there's vision. So this word sensual or senses, in the way that you describe, you go into it more, but it does already have a kind of, it's almost like a separation in there of one or the other senses or something, right? Which is never really like that in real life. And I think this gets to a lot of what you talk about. So it makes a lot of sense that you say sensuous, because then it's this whole embodied, all of it together. It's all the senses, as it always is, but we often think of it as separate. So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate that distinction.
Like, what would it have meant if the book had been titled Sensual Knowledge? And I'm
wondering,
exactly. You just said if it would have connoted that there is some kind of specific sense that I am referring to, is it like knowledge of scents or knowledge of tastes? And yes, it is interesting. I mean, of course, there are instances where we are thinking of one specific sense, and I think that that's okay. But yeah, I would go back to saying that when we say sensual, I think we just very much focus on the senses. And sensuous, when you use the suffix us, ous, it implies something that is more holistic, something that is sort of all consumed by this quality that the OUS is describing.
I think this speaks, like, even what we're trying to do now by both of us saying, oh, we're both are okay, is something that you do really well in the book, which is open the space for paradox in a way, or what seems like paradox, or what might seem like opposites, or might just be different ways of viewing something similar. I mean, you start with this because from the very beginning, we're grounded in nature, and you're expressing this kind of way of which things can always be seen from two different ways, and those experiences might be very different. And depending on what they're about, that's okay. Did you feel sometimes like you were balancing this kind of paradox or seeming opposition that you're showing isn't opposition?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the problem that we have in modern Westernized society is that we think of paradox almost as something negative rather than something generative, and something that's actually just kind of a fact of reality. Things are paradoxical. Life is paradoxical
Yeah.
experiences. And so, yeah, I am certainly trying to convey this complexity that is the paradoxical nature of experience. And also, as you point to, the kind of multi-perspectival dimension of knowledge, because in some sense, there is the knowledge that you as a subject perceive, or let me just speak of myself. So if I'm trying to grapple with something, I'm thinking of it mostly from my subjective position, but then I'm also able to think about it from a kind of wider perspective, like how is that thing shaped by society or by the cosmos at large? And so there's already that kind of double perspective. And then maybe you bring in lenses of identity, of race and gender, and just what mood you're in that day. I mean, there's just so many dimensions to the ways that we can grasp at any particular thing. And within that, there's obviously going to be a lot of paradoxes, because if I'm looking at my screen right now and I'm thinking of it just from my subjective experience, yeah, like I can see myself in the screen. I may start assessing what is the light quality or something like that. But
Right.
looking at it from, almost the perspective of the background of the room that I'm in, and then zooming out further to like the whole city that I'm in or something, like it just becomes this tiny little object. And there's a paradox in...
There's this nestedness too, depending on what you want to look, where you want to look at it from. But I think, as you were saying, we often think of it as a choice that has to be made, the paradox, right? That it's, as you were saying, it's like, it's wrong, right? It can't be both things. And also that there's only two things, that we kind of assume that. And you talk about this a lot in the book too, which I like, of it being built into a lot of our language, or the Euro-patriarch, this kind of, this path that has been predominant for a lot of people, that it gets assumed as the way it is or something, is almost built with that dichotomy of that's not real, but we don't question it or something, or if we're in a certain position, we don't question it, let's say.
Yeah, it's so very ingrained into how we look at things, which is because, or one of the reasons I think we look at things in such a binary, dualistic way, is because we are very focused on the kind of end destination rather than of seeing the whole thing, the vastness of it. And if I'm going to somewhere very specific, or I want to understand something very specific, and of course sometimes there's use for this kind of approach, to kind of really just, if we really want to just know the material dimensions of something, but we kind of apply that to everything. So if we want to understand politics or power or love or whatever it might be, we're also going with this very narrow focus into it. And when you go toward anything with facing it as though it were the destination, then what you do, like imagine you're traveling somewhere, you have a destination in mind, you're going to have checked out the weather prognosis, and if it's going to rain, you bring your raincoat, you prepare accordingly for that destination. You have specific tools and a kind of assortments of equipment with you. And that's how we're typically going into things that we're exploring. Whereas what sensuous knowledge is calling for is to traverse into that world with, a much broader toolkit, because if reality is paradoxical and multidimensional, then we cannot just come with the raincoat. We need the sun hat and the sunblock and the welly, like we need all of it, and so we need the intellectual scientific knowledge, but we also need to come with our experiential, emotional, spiritual appreciations of how to put our fingers on things.
And as you were saying that about what you pack, I was also thinking of narrative. That's an important part of your book too, and how we might read some kind of narrative about the place, and that'll influence where we go and what we see. I mean, you could explore a city that you've lived in forever from a completely different mindset. If you've read something different, then it opens up the way that person saw that city, for example. But before we get too much more into this, I brought two things up which I haven't for listeners closed yet, and that is one, how you came to the sensuous knowledge, right? Instead of how you think about knowledge, most people in terms of what you talk about as the head, right? You have these two words, which I won't dare try to say properly, but the head knowing and the gut knowing. But I'll let you unpack it better and how you came up with this, or how this hit you with a thud, the sensuous knowledge.
Sure. So the first thing to say is that the prism that I'm presenting with the phrase sensuous knowledge did not hit me with a thud. It's this kind of perspective that
the words then did. Is that?
Yeah, it's that's the world that I grew up in. I would even go as far as to say that it's kind of the soul that I was born with. It's the way that I look at the world and always have. But I've never, I guess I always felt like an outsider until I was, an adult and I'd already started writing. And then I started to realize that actually, it's not that I don't get what the rest of the world is on about. It's that I see things differently. And that probably is the very beginning of the journey of this book, which was in the making for many, many years, even though it wasn't concretely in the making until the phrase sensuous knowledge hit me with a thud.
Okay.
And that happened when I was visiting. I described some of this in the book. I was visiting the Singularity University and the NASA research camp. And I don't know what it was about that environment, other than that I was engaging with really fascinating ideas and people who care about ideas like I do as well. But there was a lot of discord. Like on some level, I felt very connected to these people. And on another level, I felt quite terrified of the worldview. Actually, that's putting it mildly. I felt fucking scared of the worldview that they were championing. I mean, this is sort of the Silicon Valley mindset. And I realized that's, again, where my two worlds collide. And so I was one day swimming in the pool that was there at the research center. And that's when this phrase came, almost like, a ball had fell into the pool from the sky. And I went back to my room and immediately started jotting down my thoughts. And I knew that it was going to be the title of my book. But the worldview is a Yoruba one in my case. So my heritage is Nigerian and Finnish, and in Nigeria, I come from the Yoruba people. But this kind of worldview features commonly across the African continent and in many other indigenous communities. But in the Yoruba worldview, knowledge is a divinity. And it's one of the divinities that creates the world. Without it, there is no world making. And this divinity is called Ogbon. And when the gods give Ogbon to the Yoruba people, they say you have to have two types of Ogbon. And this is Ogbon Ori, which is head knowing, knowledge of the head, if you like, or intellectual knowing. And then there is Ogbon Inu, which is internal knowing. So in Yoruba, it would be something like that. So it's like knowledge of the gut in English, we could say. I don't speak Yoruba, by the way, but this is through conversations I've had with people who do. And the gods say that, in order to be wise, one must possess the two. And to only possess one of these types of knowledge is to only be half wise. And so, even though Nigeria is was a British colony, is still a sort of neo-colonized country. And so the educational system is not exactly indigenous. But this kind of cosmological prism was one that was very present to my sensibilities when I was growing up in Nigeria. And I always felt cold, and not even felt cold, but I always just interpreted the world in that way. And when I say in that way, what I mean even further is through this multi-perspectival view. I guess it also came from being somebody who is from dual racial, ethnic, also religious, language backgrounds. And so for me, there was never a sense of a clear path ahead, which there was for the people, many people around me in Nigeria. And later when I moved to Sweden as a teenager, that was always the case. I think today, in today's environment, it's more and more common that I think most people almost at least in urban cities around the world would say that they don't have a sense of a clear path. You know, life is more confusing now.
We're more aware of many possible paths, I guess we could take, maybe.
Yeah, and also I guess with the internet, you know, the way that it's opened up so much knowledge and information, and people have more choices that they need to make on a daily, if not like a minute by minute basis.
Yeah, or overwhelmed by paths, possible paths.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if they're not open to us too, right? It's more we know what's out there in a different way. But I'm really interested in this because you say everyone around you had a clear path. Was that, yeah, can you help me understand that better? I kind of understand, but it's more just people assume that this is what they will be when they grow up, kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing. And I guess, I mean, Lagos, I grew up in Lagos.
Okay, so you were in the city. Okay.
Huge city.
Huge city, yeah.
Yeah, the world's fifth biggest soon.
Yeah.
And it's a very cosmopolitan city. So there are people from all around the world in Lagos. However, it was still homogeneous enough for me to feel different just by virtue of being also from Finland. And having that multiracial background. So like my family, my cousins, my aunties, my uncles, people like that, whose both parents were not just Nigerian, but Yoruba, because we have many different ethnic groups in Nigeria. You know, there's a sense in which you are going to follow the customs and the culture of your group of people, which to me was from day one never an option, because whose tradition was I following? The Finnish?
Right, because your mom was from Finland.
My mom was from Finland, yeah. And I never lived in Finland, but I did have a connect, like we traveled to Finland frequently. And yeah, as I say, I mean, these are the things that are like the concrete things about my identity, but I think there was something even deeper within me that was that had that sense of not belonging to any specific thing or any specific path. And of course, it's I mean, it's been something that has enriched my life in many ways, and continues to do, this thing of always having to, like, I've had to forge every single path that I've taken for myself. And that's enriching, but it also, in different phases of my life, was really difficult. And, you know, particularly growing up, you're always an outsider, you never quite fit in. But what it does then to one's approach to knowledge is it's a similar thing, right? Like there's nothing, I never take anything at face value. You know, people tell me, oh, so this is how women should be, or this is, even this is the I was thinking just today, to give you a concrete example of something random and maybe a bit controversial, because the sun is finally out, and I was contemplating whether or not to slap a bunch of SPF on my skin. And I, you know, normally I do, but then I was thinking, wait a minute, I mean, Africans who I think scientifically have skin that ages the slowest, and also I know that there are some cancers that, you know, we don't develop in as great numbers, and so on and so forth. And like, we don't use SPF, we use shea butter and things like that, which have some natural protectants of the skin. But anyway, that's just a very banal example of everything that comes to me is always something that I have to question, which
you can see it from another perspective, right? I think I've always thought of, I think you use this, and I like the kaleidoscope instead of either or, that there's this kind of multi-perspectival way in which you can see things, and as we are using language, it's very hard not to talk about it as one or the other in all these ways, right? Like as if everyone around you had one sort of path and you had a different one. But of course, that's not really true. But in another way, it is, because you have this very unique position, which has to do with a lot of things, not only that your mom came from Finland, but so it's like something you notice, right? When it's different from, in a certain way, from those around you, it does make you feel different. Like what you're saying with the SVF, I mean, you have another perspective that maybe other people don't even think about. And then it opens up a complexity of which one is correct or something, or there's a kind of, not in isolation, but like you said outsider a few times, in these more intimate examples of like when we're kids and we're growing up and we feel that there can be this where you see that you have a different experience. I'm trying to get at maybe some moment in your life when you started to feel that, or I'm wondering, like, did you read a lot as a kid? Were you reading poetry? I know there was music. I'm wondering how that hit you then and how you dealt with it.
Yeah. So one thing to say first is that what we're getting at here is ultimately a kind of relationship between what we take as absolute truths and power. And how this kind of multiple consciousness that came to me, whether it was almost like imposed by life in a sense, or that I also sought out, is a way of transcending abuses of power that can come with imposing a binary worldview on people, on individuals and collectives. So as a child, I was already consumed also actually with the notion of power. I was very bothered by the power dynamics that I saw around me. You know, especially those to do with gender. I could see that women had inferior positions in society, and also the same applied to girls and boys, you know, in my school and so on. But at the same time, I think, I mean, to identify this other dimension of why I was interested in multi-perspectivality, aside from my heritage, it was also because I was really attuned with the spirit of mystery. And I guess growing up in Nigeria lended itself to that. But I had several near-death experiences as a child.
Wow.
Some very uncanny ones, like I was kidnapped and, you know, things, yeah. And I myself was just really intrigued by things that would be deemed mysterious by society at large. And so one of the ways that I guess that I grappled with the duality between my heritages and then between the mysterious and the known, which of course I wouldn't have, or which I wouldn't necessarily have put that way back then, was really, I mean, yes, I read a lot, but it was mainly through going into my mind and exploring. And when I was about, I was probably about 7 years old or something like that. And what I'm going to say now is a kind of a trick also for people who are struggling to learn how to meditate. But I would play this game where I would challenge myself to see how long I could go without a thought. And it wasn't until I started meditating as an adult that I realized that
that's what you were doing. Yeah.
I'd been doing that throughout my childhood, because I would just, and it was just about challenging and sort of competing with myself.
That's remarkable, because that's not an easy thing to notice, that you're having thoughts, right? That's part of what meditation does, is you start to notice you are having thoughts and understand you're not your thoughts. So it's amazing you already had that so young.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like you had a lot of circumstances that might have, I don't know, not forced you to do that, but it sounds like you.
I think it was, I mean, you know, if a psychologist listens to this, they might say, yeah, clearly this child was going through some stuff.
Well, I mean, if you were kidnapped, and that's a big thing to
Yeah, yes, exactly. And that was just one of kind of many things. I also had a lot of happy moments in my childhood, but
Yeah,
I
and in the
definitely,
book you describe
yeah,
a lot of those too, and but also, and then there'll be a moment where you're going to school and there's dead bodies or something. So that's kind of what I mean too with this paradox and trying to almost invent a new language, right? That maybe sounds like that was part of that process too when you were already quite young. Is it's not that there was just what this world or this world. It was like there's so many different ways of seeing or being or
yeah. And this is why when I, much later came across the work of people like W.B. Du Bois, who wrote in the early 20th century about what he called, and he was talking about the racial, and maybe even specifically the African American racialized experience as one in which Black people in the US developed what he calls double consciousness. I think he defines it as something as like this uncanny ability to be able to understand the white world or the Black world and the white world, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And later you could say that Black feminists evolved this thinking to, I don't know if anyone actually writes about a sort of triple consciousness, I'm sure someone does, where you're also looking at the gendered world, you can understand the female world and the male world,
Mhm,
because you're in the position of the quote unquote oppressed.
mhm.
Um, and I think, I mean, I talk about double consciousness also in my book to some
Yeah.
extent. But since writing it, I've come to realize that actually double consciousness is probably one of the most important or valuable ideas, philosophical ideas that we have as a human species.
I totally agree with you. So
You
glad you
know, and
said that.
I think, I mean, we talk about it a lot, but we really undervalue the
I don't know
power.
if we even talk about it a lot. I mean,
Maybe it's
yeah.
in some of the sort of Black circles that I'm in, people.
Yeah, I guess because I'm thinking of having just done philosophy degrees, or not just, but in my life done a lot of philosophy degrees that he's never brought up, and it's or writing about phenomenology and stuff, and I just think that's one of the most important, crucial ideas. But I don't want to go on and on. I'm just saying thank you for saying that.
No, I'm appreciate that you also can see that, because it's another form of sensuous knowledge, the seed for people like me who then can come along and write books like Sensuous Knowledge. It's really appreciating this ability that we have as humans, and to see things from multiple perspectives, but also then connecting it importantly to a political dimension, and what living under the auspices of our political structures does to this ability, how it brings it forth or suppresses it if one is in a position of privilege, or and these are discussions that I think are really very much of the 21st century still.
And we need them so much. And maybe it is worth me bumbling a little bit here, because I did just write something about this in a way, and it struck me reading you recent after that. I mean, I'd written it, but you express it better, actually. That's why I brought up the kaleidoscope, because I was trying to think of double consciousness and Du Bois in terms, because I haven't put it on the channel yet, but I've had a few conversations actually about double consciousness. But anyway, I was thinking of it as trying to open into a kind of prismatic way of seeing the world, or kaleidoscope, as you describe, instead of this double. But it's so hard to talk about, and especially from my position, right? I almost feel like I don't have the right to even talk about those words. But then I also see them as so crucial, and even maybe more crucial in terms of American philosophy than a lot of other stuff that I have to learn in school. So this is not going to be right the way I say it, but when you grow up in a certain way and you're seen in a certain way, which I think Du Bois expresses very well, then you do have to see the world from both of these sides, whereas the other person, the white person in this case, doesn't, right? They don't. So there's a kind of reflection or something that's going on that's somehow kind of not like a good experience. We don't want to say this is good, and yet it's expanding your consciousness. It's expanding what you are in a way. So I don't know how to deal with that in the right way in language without it sounding like I'm saying one thing is good or bad, or that we've talked a lot about paths opening, right? And sometimes when you, like right now, there's so much in your book, so many things I read, so many things I've thought about that are similar, but I can't just say, oh, we have had the same experience, because I can't say my path is yours or that I know anything what it's like to be on your path. But how do I still have those moments of real identification and being so moved by it and learning from it at the same time, and not try to say, oh, it's the same as me because we have read the same book when we were a kid or something, then I know what your experience is like, because of course I don't. Do you know what I mean? How do we hold all that?
I do know what you mean,
Yeah.
and it's really complicated and entangled with all kinds of narratives that really we should be seeking to move away from. So I think one of the issues is something that you touched upon, which is the idea that double consciousness is a negative experience. And even though, of course, it does come from a very painful and traumatic history, I would want to challenge that it is a negative experience for several reasons. And one would be that because it is embedded into that kind of narrative, I think that is part of why, quote unquote, like white dominant academia or any sphere of philosophy or culture or whatever struggles to talk about, like why it doesn't become as important a theory as it should be, because it evokes these feelings of like, oh, that then, you know, that engages with the kind of racial history and my position as white or black or whatever one might be. So that's one entanglement that it for sure has. But if we can realize, actually, Toni Morrison, and I do write about this even in my book, she doesn't call it triple consciousness, but she talks about how the kind of privilege she sees in being a Black woman, because she says something along the lines of, you know, it means she doesn't have the naivety that white women in her experience have. And she is sort of forced to see the world more clearly. And as you said, like, of course, that's actually a kind of a trait, a feature in life that expands your life rather than diminishes it. The more clarity you can have about the reality that you're surrounded by. And I think that's what double consciousness is about in itself. When we remove it from its from sort of the narrative of race, which of course we can and should not fully do. But, you know, knowledge is something that is and can never be owned by any one group. I firmly believe that. What I think is important is to acknowledge the roots of how one comes to an insight, you know, and we arrived at the insight of double consciousness because human history was so ugly in terms of how it created racialized structures. And if that, you know, we cannot separate the insight of double consciousness from that, but the actual insight in itself and what it is trying to convey is not something that is only relevant to the Black experience. Otherwise, you know, you could say, why are Black women talking about it? I mean, Du Bois was a man, right? And so, of course, a person, you know, a white woman can have double consciousness in another context. One of my ex-boyfriends, a white British man, you know, he came to Lagos with me, and he experienced something that he had never experienced before because he had never been a minority white person somewhere. And that created some kind of double consciousness for him, you know, where and I think collectively as a human species, we are experiencing double consciousness vis-a-vis our relationship to what we call nature, which we actually are a part of, you know, and so we
Absolutely.
we know the world of nature to some extent, to a notable extent, but there are things that are mysterious that we don't know about the world of non-human nature, as we sort of clumsily refer to it as. And then we know the world of ourselves as a part of nature, as the human part of nature. And that is also a kind of double consciousness. And it comes with all of its murkiness and confusion also in the language, like the fact that we talk about human nature and non-human, like, if we can grasp how truly we just are nature, we wouldn't speak like that, because like a tree would not say, I'm a non-river tree, or a mountain is not like a non-tree mountain.
Yeah, it reminds me also in the book you talk about the Morrison talking about, I can't remember the phrase right, but race free but race specific or something. Writing,
Yeah.
is that connected to
I thought
this?
about that in a while. I love that so
Okay.
much.
It's
Yeah.
so wonderful that she's so amazing. Gosh, the way she puts words on things. Because I feel like what you were just describing is we're trying to have a nestedness or a kaleidoscopic understanding of consciousness, right? And the doubling is kind of the way we recognize that process, but it's not double. It's not either or. A lot of philosophers write about this, right? I did my thesis on Hegel, and there's the whole dialectic, and then, but you have the Marx, and but it's in Plato, it's in all kinds of ways in which there's a process of this doubling, but it's not either or. And I feel like in your book, you start opening us up to that triple kaleidoscopic thing. In one way, feels like through Morrison, right? She was doing it, wasn't she?
She really was,
Mhm.
and perhaps in the most powerful way.
Living it, yeah.
Not,
It was
well, actually,
sensuous
yes,
knowledge.
that is the most powerful way. But what I was going to say was through novels, like insofar as writing is concerned, because characters, she really showed how that multi-perspectival, double, triple consciousness is embodied in people, and
Mhm.
her own
Like the
person.
bluest eye, that it's just,
Yeah.
I think that's what I mean by living it. When you read that book, you live it. No matter where you're coming from, you're going to live it differently depending on all you've been through. But yeah, that connects too to the sensuous knowledge and what you write about narrative of that shift that you're showing in your book too. That's a lived attitudinal shift that comes through
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's
nonfiction.
about grasping how alive everything is. And when you do that, you become so curious about everything, because it's fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating how everything, from a stone or a branch to the conversations that we have about race or gender or anything, philosophy, there's just this surge of aliveness that is seeking to make its way and to be part of the conversation. And this is why I think, really grasping that we are nature is part of what makes this so, it kind of unlocks the amazingness of the aliveness, because you realize that, even this conversation that we're having right now is nature having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
With itself, and
it's
at the
like,
same time changing itself. That's
and it's,
another part, the
yeah,
dynamic.
yes. And we can see this more easily when we look at trees or rivers or stars, and we can see that they're not static. We see that fluidity, but we don't allow that to ourselves because of the dominant knowledge system that we're following, in which we do see ourselves as static. We think that we're having these kinds of conversations to, referring back to what I was saying in the beginning, to arrive at some kind of destination, and that there's sort of set truths that we can arrive at, whereas we are being just as fluid and shifting as any other part of nature, and just as impactful in how we're going to shape the future. And I think if that is the case, then what we can ask ourselves is, am I contributing to that shift in a way that aligns with what I believe, what I have come to understand is of value to nature as a whole, or am I not doing that? And that's where we can use that as some kind of compass, some kind of assessment, if you like, of something like double consciousness valuable. Yeah, I would say, because it is contributing with so much value to how we are a part of nature and how we are shifting nature.
Yeah, gosh, there's so much in there I want to talk to you about. Maybe the thing is to go back to the meditation too, because of when you were 7, but then I think later in your life, it also became like a practice where you're aware of it as meditation. And I feel like that's one way that you notice what you just described, that you are part of nature, you're in this nested dynamic scale of nature, and it allows you this awareness or presence, I think is a word that maybe you use, where you can participate in the way you just described. So I want to hear about the meditation of the 7-year-old you, and later, and also towards, where we started, which I haven't described yet, which is these explorers on the mountain. It's not the destination, but it's this exploration and the paths and so on. I want to get to that after, but first, meditation in your life.
Yeah. So I was meditating as a child without knowing that that's what I was doing, and had meditative experience that I would now know to label things like astral travel or past life connections and things like that, which are memories from my childhood meditations that feel, that are as momentous in my life as some of the memories of things that sort of actually happened.
Mm.
And I think that's so much because they came as a complete surprise to me. There I was playing this game with myself, and all of a sudden I was transported into what I knew was my past life. And it was kind of like, how do I even, who do I talk with about this? Because it felt so big, but I also immediately knew that this is like too mystical or whatever to bring up as a conversation. But yeah, I mean, fast forwarding, I guess the thing I should preface and say that meditation is a very difficult thing to talk about. I mean, I've been meditating for over 20 years now, and I find that, first of all, you go through so many different phases with your meditative journey. But what I have found to be consistent is that whenever I try to talk about it with people, I'm aware of just how silly it sounds. And it's just something that is ineffable and should almost be left, or should always be spoken about with the knowledge that it is quite ineffable. It's like talking about spirituality or sex, like good sex, like you can't describe it. It's something that you just have to experience. But what I can say is that I think meditation has been immensely valuable to me because I am this person who is so curious about everything and doesn't take things at face value. And in a world that is patriarchal and capitalist, and the wheels are forever spinning around this sort of patriarchal capitalist machine, it is really difficult, no matter how much you have gained, a kind of embodied sense of transformation from looking at the world differently. It can become really hard to center yourself in that, because you're just whirled away into this, into the structures that govern. And meditation is, for me, it's a political act as well as a spiritual one, because it's where I reconnect with my core self and my soul and my destiny and my heritage, my lineage, my ancestors. And I don't mean by that I'm thinking about these things, because obviously then I wouldn't really be meditating, but just by reclaiming that space where I'm just dedicated to spirit, I am politically aligning myself with other ways of knowing other than the dominant Euro-patriarchal one.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Do you, how would we relate that to sensuous knowledge, do you think? Is it a kind of knowledge, I guess? Because the sensuous knowledge that comes as you read the book, of course, it feels to me a little bit like what you're saying with the meditation. I mean, you've written a book about it and you express it, but there's almost like a practice that expresses it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does make sense. And I love that you use the word practice, and maybe even it could be praxis, because sensuous knowledge,
praxis. Yeah.
I mean, it's also in some ways an ineffable thing to speak about, which is ironic considering that I've written a book about it. But it's not, words are not enough to convey or put it this way, in my life, the book is like the least thing about my life that applies to sensuous knowledge. Like it's more how I live and how I look at the world and how I look at how my relationship to myself and to nature is. And so, yeah, in that sense, meditation is absolutely like, that would be at the sort of top of things that express sensuous knowledge more so.
And it's this poetic, this word poetic comes up too, where you can, with the praxis maybe or something, poetry expresses things using words, but not saying them.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, poetry, yes, absolutely, because poetry is, it's like God visiting us. And, you know, it's like, you know how people say that, yeah, like if it came back to earth and people wouldn't even know it. Poetry is kind of like that, you know, it's like Jesus and every other divinity and deity being around us, and we don't even engage with it because it does something with words that transcends words and transcends language. And one of the ways that I think we know that is by the way that you are automatically stilled down when you read a poem. Like if you're reading a poem that you like, because you could read a poem that you're not connecting with, and that would be, if you're reading a poem or hearing or whatever, a poem that you really like, you cannot actually be hyperactive. It's, you know, it just instantly makes everything else disappear, and you and that poem are one. There's kind of no distinction in that moment. And what else? I mean, music does that as well, but in terms of writing, it's rare, I think, in other forms of writing for that to happen.
That's a great way to connect it to that meditative thing too, and it makes me think of back to your childhood again. Isn't that when you also had this automatic writing sort of experience? And to me, when I was reading that, also felt, I wondered if that was a kind of poetic feeling or something too. I don't know. Was that in your childhood when that happened too? Was that?
That actually was the kind of start of my meditation practice as an adult. So I was in my early 20s, and yeah, when that happened, and I was writing in my journal, and then what happened was that I was suddenly writing very fast in a handwriting that wasn't quite mine, expressing things that I didn't know I had ever thought about. And that could potentially, you know, still be okay. But when I decided that I wanted to stop journaling, I couldn't. And eventually, and I could only write in like one direction toward the right. So I was ripping out. First of all, I couldn't stop. So I was using my left hand to try and stop my right hand.
Wow.
But it couldn't. It felt like my right hand was just a different, you know, entity. And then my right hand was also tearing out pieces of paper so that I could just continue toward the right. And so at the end of the session or seance or whatever, my room floor was covered from one corner to the last in paper and just this ferocious scribbling. And so no, it didn't feel poetic. It felt terrifying because at this point, even though I'd had this during my childhood, I'd had, you know, this openness toward the mysterious. I perhaps therefore also when I was around 9, 10, despite my dad's Muslim and I'd grown up with that around me, but I asked one of my aunties who was a Catholic if I could join her church, and I kind of went down that path. And so throughout my teens, I was not exactly a practicing Christian, but I had Judeo-Christian religion very much at the top of my head. And so when this happened, it was the first incident in which that was really challenged for me. But it was also the only view, the only source of understanding spiritual experiences that I could analyze it from, the religious one, that is. And of course, what that was telling me was that I was possessed by something evil. So that, you know, that's what I thought, that this has got to be like an evil spirit. And I was so scared. I spoke to my dad, who's the only person that I feel, my dad also has this sort of spiritual calling toward the unknown and the mysterious, and he's the person I've always been able to talk to about mystical things. And yeah, but he was in Nigeria, I was in Sweden at the time. And so for a couple of years or so, I just actually lived in existential dread. I thought I was scared to journal. I was just scared of myself. And what then happened was that I started going to like shops where they sold some like mystical books. And that was when I was recommended books by other people who had experienced automatic writing. And through that,
did you know it was a thing before you found those books, or were you just like, oh gosh.
No, there was one shop in Sweden where that I went to. It was kind of the only shop where you could buy, gemstones and tarot cards and stuff like that. And the woman who worked there was somebody I confided in. I told her what had happened. And she wasn't like a mystic or something. So she gave me just very hands-on. She just said these words like, oh, that sounds like automatic writing. And that was like an aha. I'm like, oh my goodness, give me everything that contains about this. And it was reading those books where I encountered people who meditated. And that was how I then started meditating.
And that sort of helped you get a little bit of distance from that part of yourself, would you say, or some kind of agency or presence with it, or just to be able to see it, hold it in a space other than being it?
What it gave me was a tiny ray of a chance that maybe it was something powerful rather than something negative.
I was thinking that word power the whole time you were saying it. And also when I brought up poetic, it's not that I thought the experience was poetic, but what poetry conveys without saying it. There's this connection to nature in the way you were describing it. There's something there it feels.
You're right. Yeah. It is because poetry is, of course, also not just saccharine and beautiful.
No. And it can be very dangerous and
so I think you're right to call it a poetic experience.
Not really, but do you see that was what I was trying to get at? That I was almost even thinking of Rumi or something, of this burner and burn, this like thing that almost consumes you but wakes you up. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it really, I'm so grateful that whatever happened then, and as I say in the book, maybe there are perfectly rational experiences to what happened. Maybe I got myself into some kind of trance state. I don't know. I'm open to all that now. But what matters is that at the time, I wasn't at all. Like there was nothing rational about it for me. I had been possessed by something. And I'm so grateful in a sense that was how I read it, because otherwise I wouldn't have gone on this pursuit of trying to understand what was happening to me.
Yeah, this is great. And I'll try to now link back to some ties, because what you just said about maybe it was you psychologically dealing with something, that we might think that is a paradox versus the spiritual mystical experience, right? And it's not, because I think at this time in your life, you were going through a lot. I mean, you had moved to Sweden. This is what in the book you talk about, where it's the first time you realized you're Black in a sense, because you didn't have to think about it before. And you were getting like, there was a lot of change, right? In your family, your dad's far away, you're in a new situation. There was some difficulty. I mean, you could probably tell it better, but the point is, like, obviously you had a lot to deal with then. Plus, it sounds like you were feeling a lot anyway, just as your human like as you are in the world. So that's somehow, for people who already feel a lot, it can be even more. But I guess the point is, if that's how you dealt with it psychologically, and if it's mystical, don't have to be opposites. Yeah.
In quotation, because I mean, it's just to offer that double consciousness again, that I'm aware that is also one way of reading the situation. But because it did push me into what has become my life path, then it cannot also just be read in that way. Of course, there was an element of mystery to it. Why do, even just in the very mere fact of why do things happen to us? Why do some things happen to us and not other things? I mean, that's mysterious in itself, you know, so.
It's all very mysterious. And that's like you were saying, that when you're in that place where you can recognize that the whole world, a leaf or everything becomes something of awe that you can learn from. But the reason I said that is not, I mean, in your book, you express what I just said, but I was more for people who are listening to where it might sound like either or. Actually, the whole idea of sensuous knowledge opens that up in a wider way. So I encourage you to read the book and understand. But the reason I also bring it up is because we were talking about there's all these paths in your life that have given you a way to contribute to this, and it's tied to power. And I want to get to the way you talk about reorienting that word. But before we do, I brought up at the beginning that you start the book with the mountain, and there's two kind of explorers who explore the mountain, and I want people to read the book, but in general, they have very different experiences of what this mountain is. And it's beautiful because from the beginning, we have this idea, which you've been taking us back to, and I want to kind of try to make explicit now, which is the way we encounter the world and our experiences of it can't just be like snapshotted of that moment. Our whole development goes into our knowledge. But I also see, I mean, there's two people in that story, but we've already seen that you were living so many different paths, right?
Right, yeah. There's also more layers to this because there's also, you know, I grew up with many languages, and language being something that has been central to our conversation and my work.
And that being another way you learn perspective. That's another consciousness in the double consciousness way we were talking, I think.
Exactly. I mean, double consciousness, I'm sure somebody has looked at linguistics through. I really hope so, because
I hope so. Yeah.
it makes so much sense. But yes, I was speaking Finnish with my mother and English with my dad, and then my parents spoke German to each other to add, you know, a layer there, because they met in Germany where they both studied. So they lived in Germany for 9 years, and my mom didn't speak English. She'd come from Finland to Germany.
Oh my goodness.
So when they moved to Nigeria, you know, you can't really, it's difficult to switch languages in a relationship. So they always spoke German. So there was also that, and yeah, but in terms of the mountain story, it's, you know, to summarize it, it's a kind of what's on the other side of the mountain. So we have one explorer. There's a story about riches in a mountain, and we have an explorer from a village who goes looking for these riches, and comes back many months later and says, "Oh no, there was nothing there. It's arid. It's dead." And then there's this other explorer who's can't let go of the story of the riches of the mountain, and they go looking for them, and then they come back months later and they're like, "Oh my goodness, it was so flourishing and abundant." And basically she, at this point I revealed that this other explorer, she has seen the other side of the mountain, and it's not that she is right and he was wrong or vice versa. It's just that they were looking at it from different angles. And the obvious truth here is that if we can look at the mountain from as many angles as possible, this metaphorical mountain, the truer and the richer our understanding of it will be. We will see the parts that are dead and arid, and that will be okay. And then we'll see the other parts too. And I start with that story because I guess I wanted readers to immediately have a knowing that the book that they're about to read is written by somebody who perceives themselves as that second explorer, as I do, especially in the world of ideas and epistemology and knowledge making. You know, the world of ideas is forever. I mean, still today, you know, it is so dominated by white men, and we are missing. It's not that, you know, some of these ideas are fantastic. I mean, so much of Hegel's work, you mentioned you study Hegel, like so much of it is mind-blowingly good, but so much of it is not. And also it is one way of seeing the world, you know, it's, and when you have like a thousand Hegel, I mean, you don't, because people like Hegel stand out, of course, but when you add all of these white male thinkers together, the worldview that we have is so utterly dominated by actually a white and a male experience, and we don't know that. It's like, especially, I think part of the curse of our times is that because we've had so many conversations about this, we think that we are living differently, but we're still following exactly that same path to knowing. And so I wanted to make it sort of clear and for the reader to appreciate that what I was doing was to bring the story about ideas from different angles.
I think the path is a great way of thinking of it, because it's like so many people have walked that way that it seems like the way to walk. I mean, so, and because now we can get to power a little bit, because so many people have walked that path, we don't think of the fact that those in power created that particular path, and those in power were white males, right? I mean, I'm generalizing, but in this bigger space that most of us live in, you just walk the path and you don't realize that there's probably many other ways of exploring that mountain or seeing that mountain, or what's important about the mountain, so to speak. So how do we bring in power here? Because this is a really important word. So I think of it as it's showing us that knowledge is a kind of journey. It's a movement, it's dynamic. There's many ways of being that movement. It's not just this thing that we've thought of as like stuff in our head. It's this lived experience. In the book, we're learning this, right? And we're getting into this practice of thinking of the world in this way and what the sensual knowledge is. And then you kind of move into some real examples of thinking about it. I don't know if example is the right word, but we think about power and beauty. Would you like to set that up a little better before we talk about power? How you think of power relative to sensuous knowledge?
Yeah, yes, because the thing is that I think it's important to first set the stage by saying that one of the problems with power is that those who have it, whether it is due to their race or their gender or their capital or whatever it might be, or us as a species vis-a-vis other nature, is that they think that the other wants what they have. That there's, that is, I think this is very complicated in a sense, but because it sounds so straightforward, but in some sense, that is the ultimate barrier to freedom from both the position of the oppressor and the oppressed, is that there's this sense for those who have power that like what I have is what the other wants. And that makes it very difficult to have a conversation about something like power or beauty from the get-go, because there's this idea on both sides that like, oh, I want power the way, like I want those, I want to be one of those CEOs at the Fortune 500.
We think we know what power is, but it's actually a definition that's been like a path that some people built for us. This idea of dominance and coercion, for example, which you talk about a lot. We assume that's kind of power. We haven't thought about it, though, in the same way that we've been talking about here, and this nestedness of, we haven't meditated on it, so to speak, or doubled it.
At face value, we need to stop doing that. And it's so hard to stop doing that because people who have it think, like, even if they want to give it away, they're still thinking that what I have is what you want. Let me tell you like a story of, this is probably common for many kids, but when I had a bird in a cage, right, as a kid, and I didn't have it for a long time until I was like, no, it can't be in a cage. I'm going to set it free. And I one day, opened it, and it took a while. Like I remember just sitting there looking at this bird, and it was there, I don't know, was it an hour or something like that, before it eventually flew out. And when it flew out of the cage, I will never forget this feeling that I had, which, in this scenario, I am the entity with power. And the bird flew away and it didn't once look back. And I felt as much as I'd been watching it going like, fly, fly, fly. But the moment it did that and it didn't care, that indifference that is power. That is what I am trying to describe as power. And what we do in our societies is we automatically assign me with the power, or even the bird as it is flying. But it's not, power is the indifferent, it is that freedom to just exist. And so, yeah, we need to sort of bypass or transcend this prism. That's why I want to stage with that. But yeah, ultimately,
it's beautiful. Gosh, and when you're talking about the bird, I mean, that's a beautiful story, and it reminded me of in the book when you talk about Rosa Luxemburg. I think there's a quote where she says she feels like a bird,
yeah,
and it is a kind of a real power that she's feeling, right, in that moment. And also, I think she talks about being, when she's in jail, she feels free or something.
Yeah, she says she writes these letters with her best friend, who's
Yeah.
like my friend. She best friend slash comrade, and she says, I don't have any identity anymore. Like, if because her friend has asked her, do you still identify with the socialists, with the Leninists, whatever, and she's like, no, the only thing that I identify with, if anything, is the bird that sings outside of my prison cell. And yeah, it's really powerful and beautiful.
And that's that power and that joy. And yeah, so we don't, I mean, you set it up very well, looking at past ways that people have literally sort of spoken about power and put it into a formula, and it ends up being about getting people to do stuff that they didn't want to do, in a way. It's like, how much can you coerce someone? How much can you dominate them? And we're talking about the paths, right? And language, and language is also a path. There's these things that we follow without knowing we are following, and that's, I think, what we're trying to get at with the double consciousness, to become aware of it. And that's what your book is doing. And then you can change this. You can understand power in the way you just described it, but it's so hard to get out of. It's almost like our very thoughts have been molded by that path of power, of even with something like social media, or that dominance, that coercion is part of how that technology is built.
And also with activism, a lot of activism that we're seeing today very much still follows that model of there being a destination and a very specific way that we get there, and it's all very much about material structures. And again, there's a time and a place for all that. Absolutely, we cannot all be like in double consciousness, multidimensionality all the time, where there are some concrete things that would not happen. But it is so limiting, and that is the ultimate sort of prison that Western thought has put pretty much the majority of humanity in right now, is that we're living in this limited black or white film, when actual reality is this multicolor, forever shape-shifting, wild, abundant, just sometimes really ugly and dark and shadowy place, but also so much richer and magnificent than we can see through this black and white prism. And I think we really need to get beyond just trying to express what that is. I mean, that's also important, but to really seeing that, it has to be about the actual experience of seeing, like, you look at your phone, or you look at a tree, whatever object it is, you look at yourself in the mirror and you just see so much more than what conventional knowledge wants you to see. And to do that, I think, there needs to be, that's where feminism comes in, and it must be mentioned at least once.
Yes.
That's where it comes in, because I think to do that, you need a streak of rebellion. You need to have some part of you that refuses to conform and refuses to abide to authority.
A little bit of revolt, I think, is the word you use, though you describe it in a really
yes, that's the perfect
particular way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's something that, in a lot of spaces where people are talking about complexity theory and this, that, and the other, I think that's the ingredient that's missing. I mean, those spaces can be fascinating. Like, people are really tapping into the richness that exists beyond the conventional and dominant knowledge. But that spirit of revolt that feminism brings into the picture is a really crucial ingredient, I think.
And that's the sensual or sensuous, I guess, knowledge, isn't it? I mean, that's this lived attitude that isn't static. Like what you were just describing, that feminism, that revolt is a lived, ongoing, ever-changing stance or attitude, or you talk about the necessity of relation. I think it's closer to that, right? But when we try to do something like science, or when we try to make sense of this in an academic setting, so to speak, then it feels like you can't have that there, right? That's back to that weird paradox or something. Like, how do you see how to resolve this? Because you've lived in both worlds. I mean, you know all of this, and you also teach, and you're an academic. And how have you held that paradox of revolt being necessary and that ongoing lived? You can never measure anything, and then also, of course, needing to put things in words and theories and talk about theories and so on.
Yeah, I think it has to do with understanding one's intentions, and not only one's as an individual, but you could say for feminism as a collective movement as well, because we're not, feminism is now very much an academic venture, as much as it is still, I would say, to an equivalent level, a kind of activist movement. But we're not going to escape that. Like, that's the fact of it. And the fact of it is also that those two things are in tension, because academia is very patriarchal, the way that, and it's very Euro-patriarchal, how it is structured, the whole thing about disciplines, for instance, that's a kind of travesty for feminism. If you think about the core purpose of being anti-patriarchal, the idea that, that feminism becomes a discipline and that people can just specialize in that rather than engaging with the kind of whole experience of gender, of womanhood, man, all of these things. And yet at the same, I'm not denouncing disciplines. I can see again their value and measurement. There's instances to catch a flight, like, thank God somebody has measured time so that I don't just go and sit in an airport and like randomly wait, or a train, car, whatever. So clearly, we need measurement. We need, I think there's a lot of value if somebody is very passionate about a specific discipline, but feminism should not be looked at in that way, even while we are developing the feminist school of thought academically. So that's what I mean by being aware of one's intention. So like, I had a conversation recently with a feminist lecturer and at a university in Hamburg where I am, and she was saying to me that, she said, could we, how did she put it? She was basically kind of asking me if I would be interested in opportunities to collaborate. But she framed it as such that, because she is working in academia, and I had been sharing with her that I'm trying to, I'm writing sort of nonfiction, creative nonfiction that hopefully appeals to a broader audience. And so she framed it as though maybe there's no space for collaboration because it's like different worlds. And it struck me, especially afterwards, I was thinking about it a lot. It wasn't, I'm not throwing shade at her. I think what she said, I understand where she was coming from, but it just struck me that how far we have moved away from the purpose of feminism, which of course we can collaborate. Like, it doesn't matter what discipline, if you're in law or, philosophy, whatever, like, as feminists, there's a mutual interest that we should be able to talk about. And because I have the intention of, of feminist revolt at my core, always, like, that's my compass, I can see it that way. Whereas if I had the intention to become a feminist professor at so-and-so university, maybe I wouldn't think about that what to me feels like an obvious truth. So I think intention is really important.
That's so wonderful. And by intention, I think it gets back to that thinking of things as trajectories or paths that can't be, that are continuous, that your whole, everything we've talked about is kind of gone into, it's not just one path, as we've noted, and it's not just, it's nested and there's scales and it's very complex and there's multi-layers and all of that, but it is continuous in the sense that it's from, it's your kind of path that no one else has because no one else is you. And that for me feels like a kind of intention too, or a kind of that we have to take that into consideration always. Or the reason I brought up measurement in that way, which is a little, I don't know what, cheeky or something, because I know you weren't against it, but I feel like that's important the way that you do talk about it, because measurement can sound like it's objective, but measurement is also related to intention, isn't it? I mean, we could think of those two people who are exploring the mountain as kind of measuring it or assessing it, and they have completely different ones, and neither is wrong, because the mountain is so vast and dynamic and different. And I guess that's what because measurement and assessment are important, but when we hear those words, we think they're objective, I think is what I was trying to bring out. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, that I do have a huge issue with. You're absolutely right. Or you're right to bring that up, because that is the problem, or the two problems with measurement as I see it is, the first one is that we want to measure everything. So it's okay to measure certain things, but there are things that maybe measuring is not suitable for, like, I mean, actually even power, I would say, but certainly something like love or freedom or justice, peace, things that we're really grappling with in our times.
Yeah, it almost doesn't make sense to put that word on there, or does it? I don't.
No, like it, I mean, how do you measure justice? Well, in a court of law, like, but as a phenomenon, like, how do you measure love? Is it some kind of equation, or,
I guess that's what I'm trying to get at here, or bring out, because we can measure those things, but they're just measurements. They're like one little kind of, they're one way of almost like a little snapshot of something that's much, like it's like a little path on the mountain, right? That the mountain's always changing, the path itself is always changing. Like you can take that little picture of the path or something, I don't know how to say it, and it can help you maybe better understand how to navigate, but you can't say that's the mountain,
Yes,
yeah.
and that is the second with measurement, is that we then believe it religiously. We believe that when somebody says, "Oh, I have measured this," that means that they are right,
And that's what it is for everyone or something.
Yeah. And that goes back to like how we're seeing the world in black and white instead of technicolor, because we are just following the measurements and missing everything, all the other ways of knowing a thing, the experiential ways, the affective ways, the spiritual ways, the emotional, like, there's so many other ways that we could try to understand justice, for instance, but we only want to understand it the way in which it can be measured.
And relative to what you bring out in the book, which we have to go soon now, I realize, but in terms of power, I think that's an important thing that you bring up, or that comes out, is because you start to talk about power in a different way. Right now, power is seen as that way, like measuring or dominance, or it's very much based on as if there's one correct, powerful thing in this coercion and dominance, but you open up branching and jouissance. That's all the stuff we've been talking about, which is real power, I feel like, but nobody seems to be aware of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing about measuring is not only that we want to measure power, and people do, there's all these A equals B, whatever, if A equals B, then B has power, like all of these kinds of equations. So there's that, but it's more that if we live in a world where everything can be measured, then we can have more control, which is the ultimate goal of Euro-patriarchal structures, whether they're patriarchal or whatever. This desire to control, and you cannot control things that cannot be measured, at least not as straightforwardly as you can control things when you can put a formula on them. And so when we do that then with power, we have to then create a corresponding narrative that aligns with the measurements. So like if B can control A, then B has more power. Okay, so now we apply that to an authoritarian leader or to the husband in a heterosexual marriage or whatever, you know, they can control, they are B in essence. And so what I'm trying to do with exusions is to think about power as something that is enabling rather than contriving and diminishing, power as something that is generous and, you know, gives life, gives abundance. Like there's no reason that we could not see power that way. I mean, in fact, I'm not even speaking about this hypothetically.
No,
I
no, no.
see it
It's
all the
like the
time.
bird in flight or
Yes.
it's is. I mean, it gets weird trying to talk about it, especially because we still use the language that's built on the old way of thinking about power. So I even worry, you know, people hear the word power and they are thinking of it in those old terms because it's defined that way. But what you're really suggesting is it's actually real power, I think of. It's like the power that we've been taught is power isn't actually power. It's not that bird in flight.
It
Yeah.
isn't. It really
But that
isn't.
exists and it's actually there. And there's a shift, which I think your book shows is a shift of cognition or knowledge once we understand that that's a whole body lived experience, not something in a head or a brain. That's a kind of shift that shows you that power, or that, what does it do? It doesn't show it to you, but you fly, or you realize you're it, or
Yeah, you feel it, you see it, and you know, it's not that complicated. Like try, anybody listening, you know, just think about when you've enabled someone else or something else to do something that that thing or person or entity was desiring to do. And that quality, you know, you can do it in just offering a seat to somebody on a bus, like that's a kind of expression of power. But once you start to really meditate on that gesture, that spirit of what is happening, you can see it everywhere. Everything is empowering. I mean, look at the way, you know, that fungi are empowering forests and clouds are empowering, right? Like, you know, you see it in every little tiny thing, and its power is so beautiful. It's like this magical superpower that, well, maybe superpower is, you know, it's
in this sense of power, but
yeah, it's really something that we can tap into it can enrich our lives or give our lives a quality and a texture of joy and meaning and direction if we start to look at it in a different way. Whereas if we continue to look at it the way that it has been theorized and how it is offered to us, it really makes our lives feel like suffering. You know, those moments where we feel, and everybody feels this in some way, some of us more because we feel it also structurally, as well as maybe in our independent lives, but we all have moments where we feel that we are being disabled in some way of like fulfilling what we want to do. And if we associate that with power, if that's how we think about power, then we're caught up in this game where we're miserable.
absolutely. It makes me think of the dance, or of um there's this way which I felt in the book. There were moments where I felt very emotional, but I wasn't quite sure why. And I think it's because of that it's written as in a way that's a practice. And kind of like, as you just, people listening can do, but that's also why I brought up measurement too, because I think part of what you just described, the way we feel when we feel unworthy or disabled, is because we don't measure up, so to speak. But nobody measures up, because that's a false dichotomy of thinking there's something you have to measure up to, or that's power, or that's beauty. So it's this weird loop or spiral that we're in of trying to measure up and feeling inadequate or something. And I kind of hear you saying, or what it kind of felt in the book, is relax out of that, or dance out of that, or whatever, you know, meditate out of that or something. And then you feel this real power, which is it's what we're part of, you know. When you relax into it with presence, you feel it. But that's not easy, right? To have the presence and relax into it. But we can do it.
Yeah, it's really not easy. But one way to try and do it is this thing of multi-perspectivality. It's not gonna, it's not like some magical tool, but when you start to think about things through different prisms, it kind of is a journey toward this kind of empowerment, because one day you'll wake up and suddenly realize that you're not in this competitive scarcity mindset anymore, because you can only be in that mindset when you're looking at things in this very narrow way. But when you've started to see that, well, okay, that isn't that one way, but there's another way to look at it, and there's another culture that views it different, or that there's these layers to everything, it becomes increasingly difficult to be in a mindset of competition is perhaps a better word. And so that's something that I really encourage, because it's this kind of ineffable thing with sensuous knowledge. So you can't give a methodology per se, but one way is like when you're confronted with something that you can't really deal with, or you're grappling with something, is to, just a simple exercise of like thinking about it through your senses, through your emotions, if you're up in your head, through your body, maybe you need to move. And then you can take it, one step further and do some research about it from like a different cultural perspective, or a gendered, racialized, whatever, and yeah, and it's not, this is not research, because of course people do that's not, you have a thesis and then you declare what theory you're using. It's like doing it in real time and with quite mundane things, like I think the practice has to start with quite mundane. I often give this example of like what you have for breakfast, what if somebody listening can think about what they had for breakfast, the bread, if they had bread, like what, with how we think about it, we would typically describe it with calorific intake, nutritional facts, whatever. But, you could also think about the texture of the bread, how it felt on your tongue, describe the taste, the sounds that you heard around you when you were eating breakfast. The tradition of the baking, does it have a specific tradition? Those kinds of things. And when you start thinking of mundanities in that way, then you eventually can start applying it also to bigger questions and issues.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that's a good way. I see what you mean, just grounding it in even just your way back to sensuous or sensuality of being present. You can, the way I think at the beginning you said you could think about the screen, you could think about the background, you could think about the room you're in, the neighborhood. There's something amazing about just noticing that we don't have to think in that either or way, and we can start to look at life just in everyday situations in that scaled, nested way. And then you can start to look at yourself and other subjects in that way, maybe. So that's really beautiful. Do you kind of, just to end, I want to come to this idea of love, because this is love and philosophy. And I feel like we're talking about love a little bit here, or that this experience of love, I don't know, is it a kind of also like that, a relaxing into that powerful or beautiful space, or how do you think of it? Is it motivating this?
Yeah, I mean, I think love is everything. Actually, love is the superpower that we don't.
Love is the mountain.
Love is the mountain. I mean, it is, because love is attention and intimacy. Love is when you love something, you pay it so much attention. You want to know everything about it. You want to know what it's breathing, thinking, eating, living, and that in return is intimacy. That's what it means to be intimate with something, is to really want to get to the core kernel of that thing. And yeah, the kind of the connection, or the difference, the synthesis of attention and intimacy is what love is. And so when we think about things, when we think about knowledge, with love in that way. You know, we become so curious, so attentive. You know, it's not just that, oh, somebody tells me that this is, this is a piece of knowledge about X, Y, Z. No, I want to pay attention to that. I want to, I want to be intimate with it. And I think what challenges us quite often with this kind of, it's eros, it's an erotic relationship to knowledge, because like even that breakfast, that bread that you were, if you eat it, if you have your breakfast the way that I described, you are having a kind of erotic experience. And of course, people, you're not going to have this every morning necessarily, but it's possible to actually find that eros even in something that mundane. But yeah, when you do that with whatever knowledge it is that one is in pursuit of, if you just apply love in the way that I've described to that, you will be practicing sensuous knowledge. That's what I mean by it, really. And there's darkness to love. This always needs to be said. I'm not talking about something romantic here. Intimacy and romance are very different things. Romance is, myths, lies. It's a fabrication of a narrative. Can be fun, but that's not the deal. This is, sometimes what the knowledge, when you encounter knowledge in that way with love, it can be really painful. I mean, if you're looking at racism or sexism as, topics that I've been working with, approaching those topics with love, with the knowledge that is embedded into them, is a hell of a journey. It's not going to be easy. And that's why I think people don't always do. That's why we don't encourage this methodology.
Yeah, that's a very important thing that you brought up, because it can just sound like you talked a little bit about how the tree or your breakfast or everything can be this sensuousness and this, it's a different it's a different way of being in the world, right? And you've said a few times you can't live that in every moment. I understand what you mean. I often think because when I'm in that state, it's like you can't hardly even go shopping for groceries, right? Because the vegetables are so beautiful and you're just like, look at the fractal shape of this broccoli. It's incredible. I mean, life does slow down or something. And sometimes we have to do things that require a different pace. However, I guess what I'm saying is it changes your way of being. It too is dynamic and nested, right? So when you start cultivating that, you learn how to sit with life. And as you're saying, life is sometimes very violent and painful. And we've all had those experiences to different degrees. And some in the book that you describe are just, there's a lot to sit with in life. But I guess love can help us do that too, right? In this space of presence, and also not identifying so fully with those experiences or that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It becomes a kind of, if we go back to the Yoruba philosophy and with the divinities, and one of the things that I also talk about in the book is like you have an ori in Yoruba, which is your head. And the ori is a very central concept in Yoruba philosophy, because you carry your head with you, and every person has a specific head, which is usually tied to the orisha, which are the deities. So like my orisha is Yemoja, she's called Yemanya in Brazil, and she's anyway. But it means that you have a sense of it's a kind of destiny in a way, like yeah. And you find yourself in situations where you're not necessarily putting your head, your ori, at the forefront, but it's always there because it's on you. It's part of your body. It's like that. So you're not in every. Sometimes you have to rush into the shop and out, and you can't focus on the fractals in the whatever. You can catch a glimpse of it. You walk past the aisle and you're like, yeah, the broccoli over there. I'm gonna come next time.
Exactly.
So there's an awareness of it that you carry along with you all the time.
Yeah. Well, I will finally let you go. I really appreciate you spending a little more time thought, and I really appreciate the book. I'm just very grateful to you. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to be sure we say? Or I know there's so much. I mean, I had identity, I had your blog, but time.
All I want to say is thank you for this very enjoyable conversation and for engaging, reading my book so closely. I really appreciate that, and I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, my pleasure.